The bridge shuddered. Not the gentle sway of wind passing through suspension cables, but a deep, structural groan, the kind that made the fillings in your teeth ache and your instincts scream to run. Rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, turning the Millfield crossing into a river of red taillights and rising dread. Dozens of drivers sat locked inside their cars, windows fogging, wipers thrashing against a sky that had gone the color of a bruise. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Nobody except Daniel Brooks. He stepped out of his 12-year-old pickup truck, pulled the collar of his jacket up against the downpour, and started walking the wrong direction toward the center of the bridge against the frozen tide of panicked faces watching from their windshields. A black SUV was wedged sideways between the barrier rails, its hazard lights blinking like a dying heartbeat. The driver inside had her phone pressed to her ear, apparently still conducting business. The center span groaned again. A crack appeared in the concrete railing. Daniel broke into a run. He reached the SUV just as the road surface beneath it buckled. He wrenched the door open, grabbed the woman by the arm, and dragged her across the wet asphalt with everything he had. Behind them, 3,000 pounds of steel and glass disappeared into the black water below. The next morning, he was eating cereal with his daughter when 5 black SUVs pulled up outside his house. Daniel Brooks was 33 years old, and he had the hands of someone who worked for a living, calloused at the knuckles, stained faintly at the fingertips from pipe sealant, scratched in the small ways that accumulate over years of outdoor work. He wore the same brand of work boots in the same color he had worn since he was 22, and he kept them clean, which said more about him than most people would have guessed. He worked for the city's infrastructure maintenance division, a small crew of 4 that patched sidewalks, repaired drainage covers, and marked faded lane lines on secondary roads. It was unglamorous work, and most days it went unnoticed by everyone, except the people whose cars avoided broken axles because of it. Daniel didn't mind. What his coworkers didn't know, what he had never volunteered, was that 9 years earlier, Daniel had graduated in the top 6% of his civil engineering class, with a thesis on fatigue failure analysis in multi-span bridge structures. He had worked for 3 years at one of the largest infrastructure firms in the country before his life reorganized itself without his permission. His wife, Claire, had died in an accident on a rain-slicked county road when their daughter was 8 months old. After that, the career he had planned seemed to belong to a different person, someone who had not yet learned that the future was not a contract. He kept the textbooks. He kept the habit of observation. And sometimes, when his maintenance routes took him across a bridge, he would press his palm against a railing and feel for vibration patterns the way a doctor presses a stethoscope against a chest. It was unconscious, mostly. A reflex he had never fully turned off. His daughter's name was Lily, and she was 6 years old and entirely convinced that her father was the most capable person on earth, an assessment Daniel found both flattering and quietly terrifying. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, refusing any offer of help at breakfast, regardless of outcome. He loved her with the particular ferocity of a parent who has already learned what loss costs. Their house was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that required strategic thinking when 2 people occupied it simultaneously, a porch where Daniel drank coffee before Lily woke up. They had a routine. School drop-off at 7:50, pick up at 3:15, dinner at 6, books at 7:30, lights out at 8. Daniel maintained the routine the way he maintained drainage covers, not because anyone was watching, but because neglected things eventually fail. He did not look for recognition. He had spent years making himself the kind of person who blended into the background of other people's days. What had happened, what he had lost, had taught him that drawing attention to yourself was a form of risk. He had enough to lose without adding more. The storm arrived without particular ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon in October. No dramatic forecast, no emergency alerts, just a steady darkening of the sky, and then rain that began to fall in sheets so dense that Daniel could barely see the truck ahead of him. He had taken the Millfield crossing on his way back from a drainage inspection in the East Quarter, and within 4 minutes of reaching the bridge, traffic had stopped completely. Daniel shifted into park and listened. That was the thing about bridges, they had their own acoustics. Every span flexed and resonated differently, depending on load, temperature, wind, and the condition of the expansion joints. After years of pressing his hand against railings and listening to the structural language beneath his feet, Daniel had developed an ear for it, the way musicians develop an ear for pitch. Most people heard rain. He heard something else. The vibration coming through his floorboards was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but the oscillation pattern was irregular. A secondary tremor out of phase with the load above, which meant something beneath the surface was resonating when it should have been dampened. He sat with that for a moment, running through what he knew about this particular bridge. Millfield Crossing had been built in the late 1980s and had undergone a partial rehabilitation project 14 months earlier, the one Daniel's crew had been stationed near when they noticed the patchwork concrete and the suspiciously rapid pace of the contractor's work. At the time, he had filed a concern through the city's maintenance portal and received an automated acknowledgement. He had thought about following up. He had not. He stepped out of the truck. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his jacket in under a minute. He walked to the bridge railing and pressed both palms flat against the wet steel. What he felt made the back of his neck contract. The cross-bracing below the roadway was transmitting vibration at intervals that matched the failure frequency he had studied in his thesis. The resonance pattern that preceded a progressive joint collapse in double-span, post-tension structures. Under normal conditions, the dampeners absorbed it. What the partial rehabilitation had apparently not addressed was the corroded anchor plate on the secondary span's eastern side. He turned back toward the line of cars. People were watching him through their windshields, their faces flickering blue and white in the storm. He gestured for the vehicles nearest to the bridge entrance to reverse. Nobody moved. In the middle of a storm, a lone man in a wet work jacket making arm gestures at strangers conveyed no urgency at all. Then he saw the black SUV, partially sideways on the bridge deck, perhaps 60 feet ahead. It had apparently clipped the car in front of it and skidded on the wet surface. The driver, inside a woman in a dark blazer, phone at her ear, showed no sign of alarm. She turned her gaze toward the window, looked at the rain, and looked away. Daniel started moving. He was running by the time he reached the concrete median. The rain made the asphalt slick beneath his boots, and the wind off the river had sharpened into something cold and insistent. Cars on either side were locked in place. Faces in every window, tracking him with expressions somewhere between fear and curiosity. The SUV was a late-model vehicle, black with tinted rear windows and the faint sheen of recent wax that survived the rain in patches. Daniel reached the driver's side and knocked on the glass. The woman inside turned slowly, as if interrupting her phone call for a stranger in a soaking wet jacket was a request she hadn't yet decided to honor. She lowered the window 2 inches. "You need to get out of this car," Daniel said. "Right now." "I'm on a call," she said. Her voice was even, not rude, exactly just the particular tone of someone accustomed to the assumption that their time was more valuable than the situation in front of them. "I understand that. Get out of the car." She studied him with eyes that were not alarmed, but were also not unintelligent. They were the eyes of someone who was rapidly reassessing whether this stranger with the flat, direct manner was a threat to her safety or a guarantee of it. Whatever she decided quickly. She ended the call. She reached for the door handle. The bridge moved. It was not a movie-style collapse, not a clean tear, not a sudden vertical drop. It was a progressive failure. The kind that announces itself in stages. The eastern expansion joint gave first, releasing a sound like a rifle shot. A sharp metallic crack that rolled across the bridge deck and went silent in the rain. For 1 second, nothing visible changed. Then the roadway beneath the SUV shifted 3 inches to the left, and the front wheels dropped into a gap in the deck that had not existed before. Daniel wrenched the door fully open. The woman had already grabbed her bag, an instinct for which he would have criticized her later, if later turned out to be available. He took her by the forearm and pulled hard, and she came out of the car with a speed that suggested she had revised her situation assessment entirely. They ran. The concrete deck behind them buckled in 2 more places in rapid succession, each crack lower and slower than the last, and then the SUV dropped. It did not fall cleanly. It rolled sideways as it went, catching the barrier rail and spinning once in the air before the river swallowed it with a sound like a fist hitting water from a great height. The structural failure stopped, as these failures sometimes do at the boundary of the second span, held by an adjacent beam that had been part of the original construction and not the rehabilitation. Daniel and the woman stood at the edge of what was now a gap in the road surface, rain still falling, the wind carrying the smell of disturbed water and wet concrete. She was breathing hard. He noticed, with the particular attention of someone cataloging damage, that she was not shaking. Her blazer was soaked through, her hair had come loose, and there was a small cut above her left wrist from the doorframe. She was looking at the hole in the bridge where her car had been. "Your arm," he said. She looked at the cut as if encountering it for the first time. "It's fine." He looked at her once more long enough to confirm she was standing under her own power, and then turned and walked back toward his truck in the rain. He had never told her his name. The news reached the city's media channels within 40 minutes of the bridge failure. And by nightfall, it had become the kind of story that displaces everything else in the news cycle. "Partial collapse of Millfield Crossing" was the headline in its respectable versions. In its less respectable ones, it was "Billionaire CEO nearly dies in bridge disaster." Victoria Hayes, founder and chief executive of Hayes Infrastructure Solutions, one of the largest privately held construction and materials companies in the country, valued at just over $4 billion, had been pulled from a vehicle seconds before it fell 40 feet into the Millfield River. Nobody had caught the rescuer's face clearly on camera. Victoria gave no public statement that night. She returned to her company's headquarters at 9 in the evening, changed into dry clothes from the wardrobe she kept in her office, and spent 2 hours reviewing the bridge rehabilitation project that her company's materials division had supplied components for. She read through the procurement logs with the expression she usually reserved for quarterly financial reviews: precise, unreadable, and entirely awake. What she could not stop returning to was the man on the bridge. She had been in high-stakes situations before: contract negotiations, regulatory hearings, a hostile acquisition attempt that had taken 18 months to resolve. And in those situations she always knew exactly who was in the room and what they wanted. The man who had knocked on her window had not wanted anything she could identify. He had simply told her to get out, with a certainty that cut through her automatic resistance, the way very few people's voices ever had. She called the head of her security division at 11 that night. "Find him," she said. "Bridge footage, city maintenance logs, traffic cameras on every street within a quarter mile of the Millfield Crossing approach. Someone was doing maintenance or inspection work in that area. Start there." The investigator spent the next 20 hours working through footage from 7 camera systems. The rain and low light had reduced most of it to shapes and suggestions. But on a traffic camera 2 blocks east of the bridge, there was a 12-year-old pickup truck registered to a name in the city's infrastructure maintenance database. Victoria looked at the name for a long moment. Daniel Brooks. A street maintenance worker. She looked at his employee record, which listed his educational background, a civil engineering degree from a state university, and stopped there. She considered what it meant that someone with that training was patching sidewalks, and set the consideration aside for later. She instructed her team to find his home address. She told them to be discreet. And then, because Victoria Hayes had not built a $4 billion company by sleeping when there was still work to be done, she went back to the procurement logs and stayed there until 3 in the morning. Daniel had made Lily scrambled eggs, which was her standing request on Wednesday mornings, and had been standing at the kitchen window drinking his second cup of coffee when the first vehicle appeared at the end of his block. He noticed it the way he noticed most things, calmly, without immediate conclusions, with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to read environments before committing to a response. The first SUV was black. So was the second. By the time the fifth had pulled to the curb and the convoy arranged itself in a double row in front of his house, his neighbor across the street, Mr. Patterson, retired, with strong opinions about everything in his sightline, had come out onto his porch in a bathrobe. Daniel set his coffee cup down. "Dad?" Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her backpack already, even though school didn't start for another 40 minutes, because she had inherited from somewhere her father's preference for being ready ahead of time. She looked at the black SUVs and looked at Daniel. "Are those police?" "No," he said. "They're not police." He watched the door of the lead vehicle open. A man in a dark suit stepped out and held the door. And then Victoria Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk in front of Daniel's small house, a woman assembled for boardrooms and international meetings, standing before a cracked concrete walkway and a flower bed, where two plastic garden pinwheels were still turning in the morning wind. She looked at the house, then at the door, then at the window. Her gaze met Daniel's through the glass for exactly 1 second, and he watched something register in her expression, a recognition, and behind the recognition, something less easily categorized. He went to the door. He opened it before she reached the steps, which took her fractionally off stride. He was aware that he was still in a flannel shirt he had owned for 7 years, and work pants washed so many times they had achieved a kind of uniform grayness. He didn't step back to invite her in, and he didn't step forward to meet her on the walkway. He stood in the doorway. "Mr. Brooks," she said. Her voice was exactly what it had been on the bridge controlled, level, carrying a composure that seemed structural rather than performed. "My name is Victoria Hayes. I know who you are," Daniel said. She held his gaze without flinching, and something in her expression shifted into the slight recalibration of a person who had expected a different first response. Most people, when they open their door to find a billionaire standing outside with a 5-vehicle convoy, did not skip the part where they look surprised. "Then you understand why I'm here," she said. "I'm not sure I do," he said. "But you can come in." She sat at his kitchen table and declined coffee, and then changed her mind when Lily came and stood in the doorway and stared at her with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was a social infraction. Victoria accepted the cup with both hands and looked at the child for a long moment before Lily disappeared back down the hallway. Daniel sat across from her. Between them on the table was a week's worth of mail, a drawing Lily had made of a horse with an approximate grasp of the animal's proportions, and a coffee ring that had been there long enough to qualify as furniture. Victoria told him what she wanted to do. She wanted to offer him a financial reward. She named an amount that represented roughly 3 years of his current salary. She wanted to offer him a position within her company's new infrastructure oversight division, which she was in the process of establishing. She said these things precisely, and without embellishment, the way she would have presented terms in a business negotiation. Daniel listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I don't want the money," he said. "It's not charity," she said, with just enough edge in her voice to indicate she had anticipated this response and found it slightly irrational. "It's a recognition of what happened. I understand how you're framing it," he said, "but the answer is the same." She looked at him. "The position, then. You have an engineering degree. You clearly still use that training." "Miss Hayes," he said, "I have a question for you." She stopped. "The rehabilitation project on Millfield Crossing," he said. 14 months ago. The materials supplier was listed as a subsidiary of Hayes Infrastructure Solutions. Do you know which component specifications were waived during that project? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the garden pinwheels was still turning. Lily was reading something in her room. Daniel could hear the low murmur of her talking to herself over the pages, which was a habit she had developed in imitation of him. Victoria said nothing. The anchor plates on the eastern secondary span were replaced with a lower load rating than the original design specification, Daniel said. The contractor signed off on a substitution that saved an estimated $12,000 on a project billed at $2.3 million. The failure started at exactly those plates. He paused. "That's not speculation. I felt it in the bridge vibration before the joint gave way." Victoria set her coffee cup down on the table. He watched her. She was not the kind of person who let her face broadcast everything, but there was a stillness in her now that was different from the composure she had walked in with, less controlled and more arrested, like a room where someone has just said the true thing that everyone was avoiding. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that my company's materials contributed to that failure. I'm telling you that a component supplied by a subsidiary of your company was underrated for the application it was used in," he said. Whether that was a procurement decision, an oversight by your division, or a contractor substitution that wasn't caught, I don't know. But one of those is true. Why are you telling me this instead of going to the city inspector's office? Because you're sitting in my kitchen, he said. And because you deserve to know, before anyone else does what's actually in front of you. There was a long pause. Outside, the morning traffic was beginning, the slow percussion of the city returning to itself after the previous day's crisis. I need to see the original design specifications, Victoria said. Her voice was different now, not stripped of authority, but focused in a different direction. I'll send them to you, Daniel said. I have copies. She had them by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, she had forwarded them to her internal compliance team, with instructions that her deputy director of engineering described as the most explicit directive he had ever received from a superior. By 4, the preliminary findings were on her desk, and they were substantially worse than she had hoped. The Millfield Crossing rehabilitation had been managed through a subsidiary called Meridian Construction Services, acquired by Hayes Infrastructure 3 years prior. The acquisition had been primarily about Meridian's highway resurfacing portfolio. The bridge rehabilitation work was a secondary revenue stream Victoria had known about in general terms, but never reviewed in detail, because it fell below the threshold applied when deciding which sub-projects warranted executive attention. It had warranted it. The anchor plate specifications had been downgraded not once but twice. The first substitution had been flagged by a junior engineer on the Meridian team and overridden by the project manager on grounds of cost and timeline. The flag was in the record. The override was in the record. The sign-off was in the record. The final inspection had been conducted by the same project manager who had overridden the flag, which was a conflict of interest that should have been caught at multiple levels above him and was not. Victoria reviewed all of it in a glass-walled conference room with her general counsel and compliance director and said almost nothing for 45 minutes. Then she said 3 things. The project manager was to be placed on administrative leave immediately. A full structural audit was to begin on every bridge rehabilitation project Meridian had completed in the previous 5 years. And she wanted Daniel Brooks on a consulting contract by the end of the week, at a rate that made her general counsel raise his eyebrows. Daniel received the call the following morning while marking drainage cover repairs in the East District. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions: whether his maintenance position would be held during the consulting period, and whether the arrangement would require signing any document limiting what he could say publicly about his findings. The answer to the first was yes. The answer to the second was no. At Victoria's specific instruction, he accepted. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that neither of them had anticipated and neither entirely acknowledged. Daniel would come to the Hayes Infrastructure offices in the evenings, after Lily's school hours, and review engineering documentation alongside Victoria's technical team. He was methodical in a way that made the engineers uncomfortable. He did not move faster than accuracy allowed. He explained his reasoning in terms clear enough that anyone in the room could follow, and he had the quality of someone who had spent years doing unobserved work. He was not performing competence. He simply had it. Victoria found herself staying later than she intended on evenings when Daniel was in the building. She reviewed the bridge files while he sat across the table with his marked-up specifications, and sometimes she looked up and found him already looking at her, not with the assessment or flattery she was used to in professional contexts, but with what seemed like genuine attention. Like someone listening carefully to something spoken below the level of words. There was an evening when they were the last 2 people on the floor. The cleaning crew long gone. The city beyond the windows, in its quieter, nighttime register. He had shown her a structural diagram of the failed span, tracing the load path with one finger. Their hands came close enough that she was aware of the specific distance between them. Neither of them closed it. Victoria arrived at Daniel's house on a Saturday afternoon on the pretext of a signature on a consulting agreement amendment. She had not examined the other reason, which was that she wanted to see how he lived when he was not maintaining the careful containment he kept in her offices. What she found was ordinary, in a way that surprised her, and then did not. He was in the backyard, and Lily was there too, the 2 of them rebuilding a section of the wooden fence that ran along the property line. Lily was holding a board in place with both small hands, her face arranged in extreme concentration, while Daniel secured it with a drill. When Lily noticed the visitor, her concentration broke and the board tilted. "Hold it," Daniel said, not looking up. Lily held it. The screw went in. Then Lily turned and studied Victoria with the same unsettling directness she had deployed at their first meeting. "You came back," Lily said. "I did," Victoria said. "Are you Dad's friend?" Victoria looked at Daniel, who was still focused on the fence and who had not yet saved her from this conversation. "We work together," she said. "That's not the same as friends," Lily pointed out with authority. Daniel looked up then. There was something in his expression that was not a smile but occupied similar territory. "She's right, you know," he said. What happened between them over the following 2 hours was unremarkable in sequence. Coffee on the porch, a card trick Lily had been practicing with roughly half the deck, conversation that moved through the audit work, and out the other side, a documentary about river engineering he had watched. A building restoration project she had visited years earlier in another city. It was the kind of conversation that builds something without announcing what it is building. There was a moment, just before she left, when they were standing at the front gate and she was looking at the pinwheels in the flower bed, still turning in the afternoon wind. She said, "Why do you keep those?" And he said, "Lily picked them out. Said they looked like something was always about to happen." Victoria said nothing, but she stayed another moment looking at them. Then the week collapsed. A local investigative reporter had obtained internal documents from the Meridian project, not the full audit, but enough to construct a story suggesting that Hayes Infrastructure Solutions had knowingly supplied substandard components to a public works project, causing the bridge failure. The headline used the word negligence. The secondary headline used Victoria's name. By the time the story was published on a Thursday morning, Victoria's public relations team was already in crisis mode. By the afternoon, the city's Infrastructure Commission had announced a public hearing, scheduled for 3 weeks out. By evening, Daniel's name had surfaced in the reporting as a consultant recently hired by Hayes Infrastructure. A detail that, depending on your interpretation, either proved Victoria was taking the matter seriously or suggested she was managing a witness. Neither interpretation was generous to Daniel. The hearing was held in the city's main council chamber, a room designed to make individuals feel the weight of collective scrutiny. 7 commissioners sat at a raised panel, and the gallery was full. Residents, reporters, structural engineers from the university, and citizens who had been driving across the Millfield Crossing twice a day for years. Victoria Hayes was seated at the hearing table in a dark suit. Her posture exactly as composed as it ever was, though the weeks since the story broke had cost her something that showed in a slight tightening around her eyes. Her legal team had prepared a statement acknowledging the findings, emphasizing her role in initiating the audit, and outlining a remediation plan described as comprehensive and made in good faith. Daniel was also at the table, introduced to the panel as an independent structural consultant. He had reviewed his notes that morning in his truck. He had not consulted with Victoria's legal team. The commissioners worked through their questions methodically. They addressed procurement procedures, the inspection failure, the scope of the audit, the timeline of the original rehabilitation project. Victoria answered with precision and without deflection, a performance, if that was the right word, of genuine accountability that even the most skeptical commissioner would have found difficult to dismiss. Then one of the commissioners turned to Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, you were among the first to identify the specific cause of the Millfield Crossing failure. You've since been engaged by Hayes Infrastructure as a consultant. Some have suggested this creates a conflict of interest. In your professional opinion, was the failure the result of negligence on the part of Hayes Infrastructure Solutions, or was it an isolated contractor error that fell below the company's oversight threshold?" The room went very quiet. Victoria did not look at Daniel. She looked straight ahead at the commission panel, and the quality of her stillness was the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see if the world cooperates with it. Daniel looked at his notes, then set them down. "Both statements are true," he said, "and both deflect from the structural answer, which is what this commission needs." He paused. The anchor plate specification was downgraded twice. That substitution was flagged by a junior engineer and overridden by a project manager. The records exist. The oversight failure was not isolated, it was systemic. Hayes Infrastructure's acquisition of Meridian Construction brought a portfolio of bridge rehabilitation projects that were never reviewed to the standard appropriate for public safety critical infrastructure. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not use the language of accusation or of defense. He used the language of structural analysis: cause, mechanism, contributing factor, failure mode, applied to both the physical collapse and the organizational failure that preceded it. When he finished, the room remained still. "What would you recommend, Mr. Brooks?" the lead commissioner asked. "A full audit of all Meridian rehabilitation projects currently in service," Daniel said. "An independent oversight structure for the remediation work not internal to Hayes Infrastructure, and a public record of every engineering flag that was overridden in the previous 5 years, across all subsidiaries." He looked at Victoria once, quickly, then back at the panel. Victoria looked at the commissioners. "We accept all 3 recommendations," she said. Her voice carried exactly as well across the council chamber as it ever had. Without reservation, there was a moment of silence, and then a sound from the gallery, the collective release of an audience that has been holding its breath longer than it realized. Afterward, in the corridor, Daniel stopped to collect his materials. Victoria appeared beside him without her legal team. "You didn't protect me," she said. "No," he said. "I told the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That's why it was the right thing." The remediation took 11 months. Victoria restructured the oversight division, brought in an external firm for the independent audit, and allocated a budget her CFO described privately as penance with a capital outlay. All 37 bridge rehabilitation projects completed by Meridian in the previous decade were reviewed. 6 required immediate structural attention. 3 were closed to traffic for repairs. No additional failures occurred. The project manager who had overridden the flag specifications resigned before any formal proceedings concluded the kind of exit that answers its own questions. The junior engineer who had originally filed the flag was promoted. Daniel was offered the position of chief infrastructure consultant on a permanent basis in the 7th month. He asked for a week to think about it. He spent most of that week on his regular maintenance rounds, which he had not relinquished during the consulting period, partly out of practical necessity, and partly because there was something grounding about work that showed clear results by the end of a shift. On a Friday afternoon, Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table when he came in from work. She looked up from her worksheet fractions, which she found straightforwardly terrible, and studied her father with the diagnostic precision she had been refining since approximately age 4. "Are you going to take the new job?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it," he said. "You've been thinking about it for a week," she said. "That's a reasonable amount of time to think about something." She put her pencil down. "Dad, you fix cracks in sidewalks. This is fixing cracks in bridges." She picked the pencil back up. "It's the same, just bigger." He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He thought about Claire, who had known before he did when he was avoiding something. He thought about the thesis he had written at 22, about the failure patterns he had spent a decade noticing from the outside of a career he had walked away from, without quite meaning to. He thought about what it meant to be someone who could read what was wrong with a structure before it gave way, and whether that knowledge carried an obligation. He accepted the offer the following Monday. The new Millfield crossing span was completed on a clear morning in early spring. A steel and concrete arc over the same river that had swallowed a black SUV the previous October. The ribbon cutting was a small, official affair commissioners, local reporters, a delegation from the city's engineering department. Victoria had declined the invitation to speak on the grounds that the bridge's reconstruction was not about her, and had come instead as an attendee, in a coat that was noticeably not a dark business suit. Daniel was standing at the railing of the new span after the ceremony had dispersed, running his hand along the steel the way he always did, reading the structure the way you read something you already know by heart. He heard footsteps on the bridge deck and did not turn around, because he recognized them. Victoria stood beside him at the railing. Below, the Millfield River moved in its quiet, indifferent way. The sky was the pale blue of early spring, and the air had the quality of something newly begun. "It holds," he said. She looked at the river. "You knew it would." "I needed to feel it," he said. There was a silence between them that did not require filling. "I'm glad you didn't walk away," she said finally. "After the hearing." "You could have. So could you," he said. She turned and looked at him then, and he turned and looked at her. And there on the new bridge above the same river where everything had begun, neither of them said what they were thinking. But the thing they were thinking was the same thing, and they both knew it, and that was enough for now.